So welcome to the final lecture of term. This time we're going to be talking about the possibility of time travel and also about the direction of time. So very much continuing on from some of the earlier week's themes. So we'll start with the direction of time, and then we'll move on to time travel. So, in the last couple of weeks, we spent some time looking at various metaphysical theories of time. So, the A theory and the B theory on the one hand, and then eternalism versus growing universe theory versus presentism on the other hand. Now, one thing that we noted was that some of these theories maybe have an easier time accounting for time's direction, or time's arrow as it's sometimes known, than do others. So an A theorist, according to the A theorist, there's a special property of presentness, and which events or moments have that property of presentness changes over time. So what is now present will later be past, and was previously future. So the A theory, for instance, has a kind of ready-made way of accounting for the direction of time, the arrow of time. So it's if you like, the direction in which the present is moving. Likewise, if we consider some positions in the presentism versus eternalism versus growing universe theory debate, there are some of these theories have a natural way of accounting for the arrow of time. So again, the presentist says that only the present exists. Now, what's present changes. So what was present is now past, and non-existent, and there are things that currently don't exist but will exist. So again, it might be that the presentist can give some account of the arrow of time, the direction of time, in terms of the changing of the present. So the arrow is oriented towards the things that will come into existence and away from those that have gone out of existence. There might be room for disputing how good an account of the direction of time this is, for instance, but at least it seems there are maybe some possibilities there for the presentist. Again, the growing universe theorist, according to them, the present is the growing edge of the universe. They can perhaps give an account of the direction or arrow of time in terms of the growth of the universe. So the earliest point is the part of the universe furthest away from its growing edge. The latest point is the growing edge, and this continually gets added to as new things come into existence, as the universe grows. So so far it seems that presentism and growing universe theory maybe have some resources available to them for accounting for the direction of time, the arrow of time. Now, I commented last week that presentism and growing universe theory are normally considered to be versions of the A theory, and the A theory, which imbues presentness with some special metaphysical status, in general allows, it seems, for some account of the arrow of time. Now, although many A theorists are presentists or growing universe theorists, I also mentioned that the A theory is compatible with eternalism, and the combination of the A theory and eternalism is known as the moving spotlight theory. So that account too has the resources to provide an account of the direction of time. So the idea is that although all of four-dimensional space-time is real or exists, nevertheless there is a special privileged present, the metaphor being the moving spotlight successively illuminating the present moment as that shifts across the four-dimensional block. So the direction of travel, if you like, of the moving spotlight, or the successive movement of the present on this moving spotlight theory, can account for the direction of time. So the sort of upshot of all this is that maybe the account that has the most difficulty on the face of it in accounting for time's arrow or the direction of time might be a combination of the B theory with eternalism. So sometimes this is regarded as a static view, a block universe view. So there's reality is a four-dimensional space-time block. Nothing changes. There's no changing present. There's only the B relations. But actually, that doesn't necessarily mean that the B theorist, who's an eternalist, can't account for the arrow of time. We'll consider a couple of approaches that they might take. And one approach is for them to seek to ground the direction of time, DOT, or in other words, time's arrow, in terms of the direction of causation, right? So causation is a topic, obviously, we looked at earlier in term. Causation is normally taken to be an asymmetric relation. That is to say, if X causes Y, then Y doesn't also cause X. That's what we normally think. So if the impact of the brick causes the window to shatter, we'd normally find it straightforward to infer that the window shattering doesn't cause the impact of the brick. And so on. It seems very plausible that all cases of causation are like this. Actually, I mean, I say all cases of causation are like this. We'll come back to cases where there might be exceptions. So time travel might be a case of exceptions. But certainly all cases within our ordinary experience seem to be cases in which we have an asymmetry of causation. If X causes Y, then Y doesn't cause X. So how might you account for the direction of time in terms of the direction of causation? Well, we've got this fourth dimension in addition to the three spatial dimensions, and even McTaggart doesn't dispute that. McTaggart thinks that there are four dimensions. There's a dimension in addition to the spatial dimensions. He thinks that this doesn't properly count as a temporal dimension because he thinks that change is impossible, because he thinks the A series is impossible. So it's just another dimension. There's nothing distinctively temporal about it, according to McTaggart. Now, as we've seen, not many people endorse McTaggart's view. But let's consider this additional dimension, what McTaggart would call a C series. So we've got a set of times in an order. And to start, so maybe starting with T, then T prime, then T double prime, then T triple prime. So we've got an ordering of times, but our problem is that we want to provide a direction. So we can't yet say whether T is earlier than T prime or whether T prime is earlier than T. In other words, we can't say whether the kind of left to right direction, as these times are denoted on the slide, is the earlier than later than direction, the earlier to later direction, or whether it's actually the right to left direction that's the earlier to later direction. Okay, because that's what we're doing. We're trying to define this direction of time. Now, so someone who tried to account for the direction of time in terms of the direction of causation might say, well, suppose events occurring at times further towards the left in our ordering, times denoted with fewer primes, tend to cause events occurring at times towards the right of our ordering. Then we could say that the left direction in our ordering, as it's denoted on the slide, is the earlier direction, whereas the right direction is the later direction. Or in other words, that times denoted by t's with fewer primes are the earlier ones, and those with more primes are the later ones. Alternatively, if it's the case that events occurring at times denoted with t's with more primes tend to cause events occurring at times with fewer primes, then we can say that the times denoted by t's with more primes are the earlier ones. So as it's denoted on the slide, the right to left direction of the series is the earlier to later direction. So that would be one approach. Now, there may be a couple of issues with that. So one might question whether it's true that causation is asymmetric, and we'll maybe see some reasons for questioning whether that's always the case later on, as I say, when we talk about time travel. But there are other potential issues too with seeking to define the direction of time in terms of the direction of causation. One is that if we do so, then obviously we can't also analyze the direction of causation in terms of the direction of time, because that would be going around in a circle. However, some theories of causation do seek to analyze the direction of causation in terms of the direction of time. So if you think back to Hume's theory of causation, a cause was supposed to be prior to, contiguous with, and constantly conjoined with its effect. So this priority in time, the notion of earlier than, is something that's built into his analysis of causation. So he analyzes the direction of time. He distinguishes cause from effect, that is, in terms of time order. So it would be circular for someone like him to understand the order of time in terms of the order of causation. So at least some people are rather skeptical of this attempt to analyze the direction of time in terms of the direction of causation. So what alternatives might be open to us, particularly if we're eternalist B theorists? So some people seek to analyze both the direction of time and the direction of causation in terms of a third factor. So David Lewis seeks to analyze both in terms of the direction of counterfactual dependence. So he thinks that events occurring at later times tend to depend counterfactually upon events occurring at earlier times, and also that events occurring at earlier times tend to cause events occurring at later times. So he seeks to understand both notions in terms of counterfactual dependence. So effects counterfactually depend upon their causes, and events at later times counterfactually depend upon events at earlier times. Now, I mentioned there's a sort of question about how we understand counterfactual dependence, why we should think that counterfactual dependence has this feature that, if you recall from earlier in term, we referred to as non-backtracking. So precisely this feature that later events tend to depend on earlier events, but not vice versa. Now, as I also mentioned earlier in term, Lewis tells quite a long story about this that at least some people have disputed in a paper that's on the further reading list called Counterfactual Dependence and Time's Arrow. It's not really a story that I propose to get into here because it's rather long and convoluted. If you're interested, then I'd refer you to that paper. It's fair to say, I think, that this approach to the direction of time hasn't really caught on hugely. A rather more popular approach that we'll briefly consider is an attempt to understand the direction of time and also perhaps the direction of causation in terms of entropy increase. So what is entropy? Well, we'll only specify it very roughly. There are sort of formal physical definitions of entropy. But roughly speaking, entropy is a measure of disorder. Now, the second law of thermodynamics is a very important principle in physics, which says that entropy or disorder increases over time. So this seems to hold at the level of the whole universe, at least arguably it does. Entropy, disorder that is, increases over time. So the idea is that the universe becomes increasingly disordered over time as mass and energy spread out. So, for instance, we suppose that the universe started in a Big Bang state where at the time of the Big Bang, or at least very shortly afterwards, all of the matter and energy in the universe was very highly compressed. There was a lot of heat and energy. The material universe was in a highly dense state, and then this was counted as an ordered state or a low entropy state. And over time, what's happened is that the universe has expanded and cooled. And so that corresponds to a higher entropy state. So entropy has increased over time according to the second law of thermodynamics. Now, okay, so what implications does this have for time? Well, so you might think, well, the second law of thermodynamics presupposes a direction of time, so it can't help us define one. It says entropy increases over time. But actually, that's not really essential. So we could, if we think back to our ordering of time, so we've just got this fourth dimension, well, we could examine which end of this order is such that it's low entropy and which end of the order is such that it's higher entropy. And then we could simply define the lower entropy end as the earlier end and the higher entropy end as the later end. So we could define the direction of time in terms of entropy levels without circularity. Okay, so granted that might be possible, why should we think it's plausible? Why should we think it's plausible to identify the direction of time with the direction of entropy increase in the universe? Well, people have argued that it's plausible because many of the processes that we associate with the forward direction in time are entropy increasing processes. So processes of aging, decay, erosion, diffusion are all associated with the forward direction of time. They're all entropy increasing processes. So maybe a sort of thought experiment is to imagine that someone has taken a video and they've maybe just taken a video of their day or like an hour or so, and they're going to play it back to you, but they're not going to tell you whether they're playing the video forwards or in reverse, and suppose that the video plays at just the same rate, whether it goes forwards or backwards, and there's no kind of distortion of the image or anything if it's going backwards. Will you be able to tell whether they're playing the video forwards or backwards? Well, the idea is that, probably, unless they're filming something very boring, like just a wall, then there's a good chance that you will be able to tell. And the idea is that you'll be able to tell because of observing entropy increasing processes. And entropy increasing processes look very weird in reverse. So, for instance, if during the video someone puts an ice cube in a glass of hot water, if someone pours some milk into some coffee, these are the sorts of cues that you'll get. What would expect is the milk to mix in the coffee, which is an entropy increasing process, the ice cube to dissolve in the to melt, in the hot water, which is an entropy increasing process. Sugar to dissolve in the coffee, and it's also an entropy increasing process. Basically, key ways in which you'd be able to tell would be observing entropy increasing processes. Now, there are other things that might not obviously strike you as entropy increasing processes that it might also provide clues. So obviously, if you saw any human behavior or human speech, for instance, then obviously that would look very peculiar being run backwards. Likewise, if you observed things falling to the ground, again, that would look very peculiar going in reverse. Now, it's a bit more of a complex story, but it actually turns out that it's quite plausible that all of these things too are or depend on entropy increasing processes, that again, viewing them in reverse would be to view entropy decreasing, and again be very peculiar. So the advocates of this approach will sort of argue that all the telltale signs of whether we're looking at something evolving in the forwards direction of time or the backwards direction of time are entropy increasing processes. So they'll suggest that there may be, it's absolutely critical to the very notion of the forwards direction of time that entropy increase, and hence they will justify their analysis in those terms. Okay, so this is already something I've said. Consider the ordering of times along the time dimension. If entropy is higher, say at the end with corresponding to times denoted with t's with more primes, then that's going to be the later direction. If, on the other hand, it's higher on the end associated with the t's with fewer primes, then that's going to be the later direction instead. So that would be how we analyze the direction of time in terms of entropy increase. Okay. So there are some avenues, even if you're a B theorist, eternalist, for accounting for the direction of time. It should be noted that the direction of time isn't necessarily the same as the passage of time. So even if you successfully give an account of the direction of time, that doesn't automatically mean you think that there's any such thing as the passage of time. So, as I've said, the B theorist eternalist can account for the direction of time. So maybe the earlier times are just those that are lower entropy, later times are those with higher entropy. But that doesn't seem to entail that in any sense time passes, right? In fact, B theorists seem to think that time doesn't pass, right? So there's no privilege present. But there is an asymmetry between earlier than and later than, but no movement, if you like, of time. And most B theorists will be reasonably comfortable with the idea that there's no genuine passage of time, that it's somehow, to the extent that we have an experience of this, that it's somehow illusory, as McTaggart argued. Okay, so let's shift on to a slightly different but related topic, and that is the topic of time travel. So most of us have come across various time travel fictional stories, so either books or movies. There's so many time travel movies. So movies like Interstellar, movies like Donnie Darko. Comes up in Harry Potter, comes up in, I guess Back to the Future, dozens at least of movies, books and TV shows. Doctor Who, I suppose, probably many of you will have seen. Now, I suppose it's sort of been an intriguing question to philosophers and physicists as to whether time travel is, in some sense, possible. Now, if time travel happens, if it's possible, if it even happens in our universe, then it's probably fairly unlikely to correspond to the way in which it's depicted in at least some of the time travel fictions that we may have all enjoyed. So maybe some are a bit closer to how time travel could actually occur if it did occur than others. And we'll discuss this a bit as we go on. So David Lewis defends the notion that time travel is possible in the sense of being metaphysically or logically possible. He doesn't argue that it's physically possible. So I think I mentioned earlier in terms, sometimes philosophers distinguish these notions. So physically possible means that it's permitted by the laws of nature that obtain in our world. And the idea is that maybe there are other possible worlds that have different laws of nature. So maybe there are worlds in which Newton's laws hold rather than the laws of general relativity. And maybe there are even sort of worlds with really quite different laws from any that we've considered for our world. So to say that time travel is metaphysically possible is to say that it's possible in a broad sense. So that there is at least one possible world in which it occurs, where that possible world isn't required to have the same laws of nature as ours. Physicists and philosophers of physics have also argued or discussed whether time travel might actually be physically possible, that is to say, permitted by the laws, in particular, of general relativity. And actually, it looks like there's a plausible case to be made that time travel is permitted by the laws of our universe. Again, that's not to say that the time travel in question would be anything particularly resembling that occurs in certain science fiction movies or books. Although some of them aren't a million miles from the mark. So if anyone's seen the film Interstellar, that's somewhere in the ballpark of what time travel might look like if it occurred in our universe. Okay, so but Lewis is arguing for a weaker claim, just that it's metaphysically possible, and there are some sort of obstacles even in arguing that it's metaphysically possible. So there are some apparent paradoxes or contradictions that time travel would seem to involve, and so people might think that it's impossible, that it couldn't occur in our universe or any others because it would involve logical contradiction. And Lewis is keen to try to dispel the notion that it does involve logical contradiction. So in order to make sense of the notion of time travel, Lewis distinguishes between what he calls external time on the one hand and what he calls personal time on the other. So external time is, as it were, real or objective time. Personal time is person relative. It's to be measured in terms of things like a person's metabolic and physiological processes, I guess psychological processes maybe too. And right, okay, so the idea is that an hour's external time has elapsed if 1 hour objectively passes, whereas an hour's personal time has elapsed for a specific person if that person undergoes the metabolic, the physiological, the psychological processes that would ordinarily take 1 hour's external time to elapse. So there's a fact of the matter about what sorts of metabolic, psychological, physiological change a person ordinarily undergoes in 1 hour external time, and it's that amount of change that constitutes 1 hour in personal time. So there's a sort of boring sense in which we're all traveling in time towards the future, normally at a rate of 1 hour in personal time per hour in external time. So normally in 1 hour of external time, the metabolic and so on changes that would expect to occur in 1 hour of external time do in fact occur in 1 hour of external time. But what we normally mean by time travel, certainly the interesting sort, according to Lewis, occurs when personal time and external time diverge. So Lewis appeals, so if you remember right back to the beginning of term, the theory of perdurantism, or the temporal parts theory of persistence, Lewis appeals to that in order to make sense of time travel. He also seems to presuppose eternalism. So what Lewis says is that suppose that two different temporal parts of the same person differ by a positive amount of personal time, for instance, an hour, but a negative amount of external time, maybe 1,000 years. So the idea is that the temporal part of the person that exists 1,000 years earlier is nevertheless slightly older, maybe an hour's worth of personal time earlier, older, and maybe has memories of the temporal part that exists 1,000 years later. Then, according to Lewis, that person may be said to have travelled into the past. On the other hand, suppose that two temporal parts of a person differ by a positive amount of personal time, again, maybe an hour, but a far greater amount of external time, for instance, 1,000 years. So there's one temporal part that maybe exists now. There's another temporal part of them that is only an hour older in personal time, but that's located 1,000 years in the future. Then that person may be said, according to Lewis, to have travelled into the future. Okay. So time travel occurs when there's this sort of discrepancy between personal time and external time. Now, we need to say a bit more than this, because it's critical for these to be genuine cases of time travel that we have identity between the person who departs and the person who arrives. If you like, put in terms of the temporal parts view, the perdurantist view, it's critical in order to say that the person's time travelled, that the two temporal parts be genuinely temporal parts of the same person. So if the temporal part that exists now and the one that exists 1,000 years in the past, or the one that exists 1,000 years in the future, if these are not temporal parts of the same person, then we can't genuinely say that the person has travelled in time. So, yeah, it would be something like one person instantaneously vanishing at one time and another instantaneously appearing at another time. Not time travel unless we can identify those two people. So, what makes it the case that various temporal parts, which might be discontinuous in time, parts of a single person, so, for instance, the part that exists now and the part that exists 1,000 years in the past? Lewis's answer is that what makes them identical, or if you like, temporal parts of the same person, is that there is mental continuity between them. So maybe the temporal part way in the past has memories of the experiences of the temporal part in the present. They should be physically resembling or physically continuous. So if this is the case of genuine time travel, you expect the temporal part way in the past to resemble the temporal part in the present. Maybe an hour older looking. Well, maybe you can't tell the difference, but maybe some you could do some sort of physical examination, determine that they're basically the same, but they've undergone an extra hour's worth of metabolic processes or something like that. And also causally related. So, for instance, if the temporal part in the present had just eaten breakfast, then that would cause the temporal part existing way in the past to not be hungry, for instance. Okay, now this third criterion, the causal relation, note, requires backwards in time, specifically backwards in objective or external time causation. So if we're having backwards time travel, in order for it to be a genuine case of time travel, we need it to be the case that the properties of the temporal part of the person that exists in the present causes the properties, or cause the properties of the temporal part that exist in the past. So that's a case of backwards in time causation. So if we have genuine time travel, then it looks like we need an exception to this notion that causation is always in the forwards direction of time. Now, that might give us at least some reason, insofar as we're committed to the possibility of time travel, that might give us some reason to pause in seeking an analysis of the direction of time in terms of the direction of causation. Now, travel into the future, of course, doesn't seem to require any sort of backwards causation, but it still seems to require some odd form of causation. So if there's no continuity between these two temporal parts, so there's a temporal part of a person in the present and then one 1,000 years in the future with no intervening temporal parts, then it looks like in order to claim that the properties of the temporal part in the present cause the properties of the temporal part in the future, so that they're genuinely two temporal parts of the same person, there would need some sort of strange action at a temporal distance, so that appears to be unmediated. So, in other words, the properties of the earlier person stage must cause the properties of the significantly later person stage without intermediate causal processes. So, yeah, I guess there's a question about whether we should accept that this is possible. But it looks like it's not obviously impossible. And it looks like if we're going to commit to time travel into the future, we'd have to commit to something like this. Now, one worry that some metaphysicians have had about the possibility of time travel, specifically of time travel into the past, is that it opens up the possibility of causal loops. So, for instance, suppose that I am a time traveler, and maybe I've got a time machine that allows me to travel in time, and I have in my possession a book of instructions that told me how to build my time machine. I travel back into the past and hand this book of instructions to my younger self, thus giving him the wherewithal to construct a time machine. Now, this seems to be a causal loop because my younger self only has the ability to construct a time machine because my older self gave him the time machine instruction book. But my older self only has the time machine instruction book, because when he was younger, he was given the book by his older self. So it seems we have a causal cycle, a causal loop. Now, is this paradoxical? Well, causal loops certainly seem weird, very unfamiliar to our ordinary experience. So again, this would be an instance where I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture that ordinarily we think of causation as asymmetric. So if X causes Y, then Y doesn't also cause X. Well, it seems that we've got an exception to this if we have a causal loop, because, for instance, my earlier self's possession of the Time Machine instruction manual causes my older self to possess it, but my older self's possessing it causes my younger self to possess it. So it seems we have a violation of causal asymmetry. Now, is this problematic? Well, certainly it's unfamiliar. Within our experience, causation is asymmetric and causal cycles don't happen. But just because it's unfamiliar doesn't mean it's necessarily paradoxical or contradictory. So someone might say, well, look, okay, we find it weird, the notion of a circle of causation. But actually, it's not much more weird than the sorts of causation we're used to. So suppose that you're asked to causally explain where you came from, then you might say something about your parents. But if you're asked to causally explain where your parents came from, then you'd have to appeal to your grandparents and then to explain them to your great-great-grandparents. And this could go on until you got back to, whatever the last common ancestor of humans and the great apes were, and then back to more primitive organisms, and then back to basic proteins being formed in a primordial soup, and eventually all the way back to the Big Bang. So our ordinary explanations seem susceptible to a regress. So we can explain Y in terms of X, but once we've explained Y in terms of X, there's a question of, well, what accounts for X? And so then we've got to appeal to something earlier than X, W, which explains X. And then, again, you could ask the same question about W. So it seems you're sort of off on a regress. Now, and maybe this regress terminates with the Big Bang, but then that's kind of weird because you've got something that itself doesn't seem to be explainable, but that explains everything else. Or maybe you think even there's an infinite regress, but again, that also seems weird. So how can there be any explanation at all if we just go on to infinity? So the sort of counter would be to the someone who questions the coherence of the notion of an explanatory or causal loop would be to say, well, our ordinary patterns of explaining are, in a sense, just as weird. It's just we're more familiar with them. They're susceptible to regresses, not to loops, but maybe a regress isn't any better than a loop. So in any case, Lewis thinks that, causal loops would be weird, but they're not obviously impossible. What he does think is impossible is changing the past. So he thinks a time traveler just can't change the past. There's only one way the past actually is, not two different ways with the time traveler switching it from one to the other. He thinks the idea of the sort of change of the past would be incoherent, just because there's just one way that the past is. Now, that, according to Lewis, doesn't mean that a time traveler can't affect or cause the past. It's just that she's got to cause it to be the way that it's always been. So, for instance, the causal loop example, my older self didn't change the past, He just caused it to be the way it's always been by handing his younger self the time travel manual. But it's always been like that. It's not like there are two versions of the past, one in which the younger self doesn't have the time travel manual and one in which he does. But this sort of connects with the grandfather paradox. So the grandfather paradox is quite famous, and maybe is a sort of rather striking attempt of, a rather striking illustration of an attempt to change the past. Shows vividly how changing the past seems not to be possible, and some people have thought that this seems rather paradoxical. So the grandfather paradox, the basic question is, suppose that there's a time traveler, and she really dislikes her maternal grandfather, perhaps because her maternal grandfather was very cruel to her mother. So she really dislikes him, and in fact she wants to kill him. I mean, he's now dead of natural causes, but she wants to kill him. So her plan is to get into a time machine and travel back in time to a point before her mother was even conceived, and kill her maternal grandfather. Perhaps she wants to go back that far to prevent her maternal grandfather ever being cruel to her mother. Now, okay, suppose that this time traveler has a gun that's in perfect working order, regularly maintained. She's an excellent shot. She's very motivated and invariably follows through on the things that she's motivated to do. She has a time machine. She travels back to, say, a year before her before her mother was conceived, and finds her maternal grandfather, and she's still very motivated and points a gun at him and so on. Now, she can't kill her maternal grandfather, or at least she doesn't kill her maternal grandfather. We know she doesn't because she exists. But if she did kill her maternal grandfather, then she would not exist because her mother would never be conceived, and so she wouldn't be conceived either. So she wouldn't exist. So the fact that she does exist is, if you like, proof that she doesn't kill her maternal grandfather prior to her mother's conception. Okay, so another way of putting this is that, well, if she did kill her maternal grandfather prior to her own conception, then a paradox would be true. Namely, she killed him, but she didn't kill him because she wouldn't exist, right? So if she killed him, then she wouldn't kill him. If she killed him, her mother wouldn't be born, so she wouldn't be born, so she wouldn't kill him. So if she did kill him, a paradox would be true. Paradoxes can't be true, right? Contradictions can't be true. So we can infer that she didn't kill him. Okay, so what's the paradox, right? So, well, the paradox isn't that she killed him. We have to accept that she didn't kill him, because that genuinely would involve a contradiction, and contradictions can't happen. So, can we just leave it there? Is there still a problem? Well, Lewis acknowledges that there is still arguably a problem, namely that on the one hand, it seems that she can kill him because she has the motivation, she has the gun, she has the time machine, and so on. But on the other hand, it seems that she can't kill him, because if she did, then a contradiction would be true. So we have a tension between the claim that she can kill him and the fact that it seems that she can't kill him. So what's going on here? So what Lewis says is that basically this involves an equivocation on the word can, right? So she can kill him in one sense, but she can't kill him in another sense. And Lewis thinks that the word can is quite slippery in this way, so it's sort of easy to arrive at these equivocations. Specifically, he thinks that the word can expresses the compatibility of something. So if I say I can do X, then this expresses the compatibility of X with a certain set of facts. So he gives an analogy. He says, he gives the example, I can speak Finnish. Now, he says, well, there's a sense in which he can speak Finnish, but also a sense in which he can't speak Finnish, just as there's a sense in which the time traveler can kill her maternal grandfather, and a sense in which she can't. And both of these, they're two different senses, so they can both be true at the same time. So the sense in which Lewis can speak Finnish is that his speaking Finnish is compatible with his physiology. So his physiology is not relevantly different from the physiology of native Finnish speakers, say. So his speaking Finnish is compatible with his physiology. So in that sense, he can speak Finnish. But nevertheless, his speaking Finnish isn't compatible with the further fact that he's never learned Finnish. So once we take into account that further fact, well, that seems to discount the possibility of his speaking Finnish. So it's incompatible with this additional fact. So that provides a sense in which he can't speak Finnish. His speaking Finnish is not compatible with the fact that he's never learned. So the meaning of can essentially can change, right? So, and maybe context determines what set of facts are relevant, and can expresses whether X is compatible with a particular set of facts. So Lewis thinks that a similar thing is going on with the time traveler, right? So she can kill her maternal grandfather in the sense that it's compatible with her motivation, her equipment in the sense of her having a gun, her being a good shot, and her being motivated and so on. So in that sense, she can. It's compatible with those facts. But it's not compatible with the further fact that she is the granddaughter of this man and that her mother has yet to be conceived. Right, so it's not compatible with that richer set of facts. Now, in order for her to actually do something, not just be able to do it, not for it just to be the case that she can do it, it has to be that it's compatible with all of the facts, right? The richest possible set of facts, which includes the fact that she's this person's granddaughter. And that her mother hasn't been conceived. So it's not compatible with those, so we can infer that she doesn't in fact do it, even though there's a sense in which she could do it. So Lewis thinks there's no paradox, right? So there's just this equivocation on the word can. She doesn't, despite there being a sense in which she can, so she'll change her mind, or a gun will jam, or something like that. Now, I suppose a lot of people have thought, well, there's something a bit fishy about this line of reasoning. So to say that you can do something, but there's no world in which you actually do it, might seem fishy, right? So it looks like there's no world in which this time traveler can kill or does kill her maternal grandfather before her mother's conceived. And so we might say, okay, you can sort of play all the semantic games you like with the word can, but if there's no world in which she does do it, then it looks like there's a pretty strong sense in which she just isn't able to do it. She just can't do it. Obviously, if there were such a world, then it would be a world of paradox, a world of contradiction. And, even Lewis would admit there's no world like that. So Lewis has a response to this. He says, well, there are, in a sense, worlds in which... So suppose that this time traveler is called Alice and the person she kills is called Bob. Well, he says, look, there are worlds in which Alice kills Bob. But these are just not worlds in which Alice is Bob's granddaughter, and the time of death is prior to the conception of Alice's mother. So he says it's these worlds in which Alice kills Bob that ground the truth of Alice can kill Bob in a robust sense. So, for instance, he says, well, these worlds where Alice does kill Bob are worlds in which maybe someone other than Bob is Alice's grandfather, or in fact, Alice's mother was already conceived by the time Alice kills Bob, or in which Alice wasn't a time traveler, but rather someone who just appeared out of nowhere with false memories, as though she were a time traveler, and killed Bob. So he says, look, if we're looking for a possible world in which Alice kills Bob to ground this claim that Alice can kill Bob, well, there are such possible worlds, but they're not worlds in which Alice is a time traveler and the time that she kills Bob is prior to the conception of Alice's mother, because those worlds would be contradictory, and no contradictory world exists. So Lewis has some rather ingenious ways of trying to get out of that. I suppose get out of the grandfather paradox. There's so you might find this plausible. There are still possible angles that one might take in defending the notion that we have a genuine paradox here. So if you're interested on the further reading list, there's a discussion involving Vivellin and Cider. So Vivellin, says, okay, well, maybe in Lewis's version, the grandfather paradox doesn't look so problematic, but he considers another version where, in fact, thousands of time travelers all try to travel back into the past to kill their maternal grandfathers prior to the conception of their mothers. Actually, his example's a bit different. He imagines all the thousands of time travelers trying to kill themselves, their younger selves, and it looks like all of them will fail. So in each case, there'll be a jammed gun, or they'll kill someone who turns out not to be their maternal grandfather, or they'll slip on a banana skin, or have a last minute change of heart. Now he says that the possibility of time travel seems to open up this sort of possibility, but the fact that they all fail just seems like a massive cosmic coincidence, given that they all have the wherewithal and the motivation to succeed. So then the question is, if that's right, do we just think that such a cosmic coincidence is impossible? And if time travel could lead to or makes possible such a cosmic coincidence, do we therefore say that time travel is impossible? So that's the debate between Vivellin and Cider. So I think I'd refer you to that if you're interested in pursuing this further. But certainly there's a lot of sort of interesting questions raised, and there are discussions. There are people who take both views on this debate. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture, and that's the final lecture of term. I hope that you enjoyed it. And there's just a reminder on the final slide about the nature of the summative essay, so 2,500 words. The deadline is the first day of term 3. Now, obviously, many of you will have extensions, so you can self-certify for an extension of 2 weeks under the current UCL policies, or you might have longer extensions due to extenuating circumstances applications, but at least the nominal deadline for those who don't have any form of extension is the 26th of April. Just a reminder that the list of summative essay questions is available on Moodle. It's the very same list as the list of formative essay questions. This reflects the fact that you can answer the very same question for both your formative and summative essays. So if you've already written a formative essay, you're very welcome to just expand it, hopefully in line with the comments that you received on it, into a summative essay. And obviously make sure you just need to answer one of the questions. So don't answer multiple questions from the list. Okay, well, as I say, I hope you enjoyed the module, and hopefully I'll see some of you in future for some of my third year modules. Otherwise, I hope you have a very good break. Okay, bye.